to go until the final votes in this midterm election. So you know where we are tonight. We are out on the campaign trail. And in a bit of 2016 deja vu, so is former President Trump and his former opponent, Hillary Clinton. So is Mr. Trump speaking for GOP candidates or for his own 2024 ambitions? We're live in Georgia, in New York, and at the White House, where they're on defense over what President Biden's been talking about. Then, because you know all politics is local, we are getting local with those races for school board, the folks who pretty much decide what your kids, your nieces, your nephews learn. The new details on the big money getting pumped into these races. Plus, in just the last couple hours, we're learning U.S. Embassy officials have met now in person, spoken with WNBA star Brittney Griner for the first time in months. While they're not previewing great news for a potential prisoner swap, we'll explain. And a huge shift in streaming, with Netflix now unveiling this cheaper ad-based subscription. But there is a big catch, why you might not be able to see the most popular shows if you sign up. And those gorgeous glaciers in Yosemite might not be there for long. We'll talk about why the clock's ticking to save one of the world's key water reserves later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and right now you've got Democrats flooding blue states trying to protect against a potential red wave. Look at what happened in just the last hour. We've seen President Biden defending the work of his administration by turning to a closing message on the economy and student loan debt. It's one of several closing messages that President Biden has been delivering. And here we are now with 5 days until voting ends, with the president making the case in New Mexico out west, saying the anger from Republicans over his loan debt plan is wrong.
Their outrage is just simply wrong. And I might add, I don't want to be too political here, but hypocritical. Fighting them in court or not letting them get away with it.
So in an hour or so, you've got the president heading to California to raise money for a House candidate. And we've talked a lot about former President Barack Obama's visits, but there's another name on this map that we haven't talked a lot about. Former President Trump. He's kicking off a 4-state blitz tonight in Iowa. Iowa, folks, okay? Iowa, like the big presidential election state. The symbolism is real heavy-handed here because this is a place where aspiring presidents go to dream, right? The first in the nation election, Mr. Trump is not shy about teasing 2024, with Reuters today reporting he's considering launching a run maybe by Thanksgiving, with one advisor saying Donald Trump and 2024 is like a moth to a flame. Do Iowans really want to see him? A majority there now don't have a positive view of the former president, even though he won the state by 8 points 2 years ago. Somebody who we will see, his 2016 opponent, Hillary Clinton. She's up with Vice President Kamala Harris tonight in Manhattan at an event for Governor Kathy Hochul. We're going to talk about that with Ron Allen and the symbolism there in just a second. We'll also break down what President Biden's up to with Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. But let's start in Georgia, where you have Republican candidates, it seems, based on some of the polling, starting to maybe pull ahead. This is where we're finding our Blaine Alexander. And Blaine, any minute now, we're going to see Governor Brian Kemp campaigning with Chris Christie, right? This is, again, a time 5 days out. The big guns are coming in, the surrogates. Chris Christie, a conservative big gun, you could say. His special guests are really interesting. He's had former VP Mike Pence. He's had Arizona Governor Doug Ducey with him. What do they have in common? These are all Republicans who have had conflict with former President Trump. Talk about why Kemp is bringing them in these closing days.
Because in many ways, Hallie, he's in the same boat. You know, this is somebody, the governor here in Georgia, who had a very public split, a very public falling out with former President Donald Trump over the election results here in the state of Georgia. So, yes, bringing in those Republicans who share kind of that same similarity with him certainly is sending a very interesting message. I think what's really interesting to watch in this race is that Brian Kemp is somebody who has weathered those withering attacks from the former president. And not only did he survive a primary challenge from a Trump-backed candidate, but he beat him mightily. He beat him, in a very decisive way and came on to this general election. So in many ways, if he does win re-election here in the state of Georgia, it'll be something that a lot of people around the country are watching, because he'll have that distinction of having essentially been targeted by the former president and still survived and won re-election to his office, Hallie.
You know, there's this trend we've seen in a few states, Blaine, where the Senate races are closer than the governor's races. That is true where you are. Senator Raphael Warnock, the incumbent Democrat, Herschel Walker, his Republican opponent, basically neck and neck, right? They're well within the margin of error. But then look at Stacey Abrams, right, and Governor Brian Kemp. Not as much of a run for his money as I think Democrats would have liked to be seeing at this point in the race. You have some exclusive reporting, I know, from the Abrams campaign. Talk about how they see this.
Yeah. Well, let me talk first about the governor's race. I think what's really interesting about that race, as opposed to the Senate race, for lack of a better term, there's really not a lot of drama in it. There aren't kind of the personal attacks. There's not the personal drama. It really is a race that comes down to policy positions. And so it's something that it's pretty clear cut on either side where either candidate stands. Now, something that folks on Kemp's side, Republican sources, have told me is that one place where they are looking to turn around votes and where they believe they're picking up some votes this time around is with swing voters. Some people who back in 2018, because of how closely he aligned he was with Trump at the time, maybe kind of steered away from him. But now that they've seen him govern for 4 years, more people are coming to his side. That's a category that they're looking to very strongly. But yes, reporting from the Abrams campaign says that of the number of registered voters here in the state of Georgia, more of them tend to vote Democrat than Republican. So they say if every single registered voter actually casts a ballot, they will win this race. So that's why in these final days, Hallie, they are leaning all in on really kind of mobilizing their ground game, getting people out and trying any way they can to get people to the polls.
Blaine Alexander, who is out at a busy event. I know they're in Atlanta. Blaine, thank you. Let me go to Ron Allen in New York, who is also at a busy event. I know that it's going on. I think we've got a live shot of what's going down in the campaign event that is behind you or near you, Ron. Chuck Schumer on stage now, the Senate Majority Leader, of course. He is hoping to stay the Senate Majority Leader, right, after election night come Tuesday. You also have this really interesting governor's race where you are, Ron. We wouldn't have been talking necessarily a year ago about whether or not, well, she wasn't governor, but whether or not Kathy Hochul would stay governor. You've got Congressman Lee Zeldin, who is making a real play here, partly on the issue, right, by focusing on the issue of crime in New York State.
And in New York City, which is why this is happening here. Zeldin's been in New York City as if he's been running for mayor of New York City, which is very unusual for Republican candidates. But we are now on the campus of Columbia University, the Barnard College. This is one of the colleges of that university. It's an all-women's college. And this is a star-studded, history-packed event, and Chuck Schumer is the only man we may see on stage. The vice president is here. Hillary Clinton is here. The state attorney general, Letitia James, who was the first woman of color ever elected statewide here in New York, is here. And Kathy Hochul, who's running for governor and trying to become the first woman to win that seat outright by an election, is here. She may be overshadowed by her guests who have come here. But this is a sign of just how intensely the Democrats are trying to hang on to this, to push her over the finish line, to push Hochul over the finish line. There's a 2-to-1 Democratic advantage here in this state. There hasn't been a Democratic governor, a Republican governor here since 2002. There are all these fundamentals that are working against Democrats, and Hochul is just hanging on. So we expect to see a lot of star power, a lot of history in this room. It's get out the vote time. Voting early started here over the weekend. Hochul is trying to create excitement. She is trying to create energy. Lee Zeldin, the Republican, has been surging in the polls during the past couple of weeks, and it's just unbelievably close. That some Democrats would tell you this is just not something that they foresaw coming. There was a lot of anxiety about some House races here, as you're aware, because of redistricting and a lot of lawsuits and a lot of contentious things that happened there, which have put as many as 9 seats here in this state in play, which is also unprecedented. But at this moment, it's all about the governor. It's all about the top of the ticket. And this history-making, star-studded cast trying to push her over the finish line. Hallie?
Ron Allen live for us there in New York City. Ron, thank you. Let me go now to Kelly O'Donnell, who's at the White House. And you've got President Biden out. Kelly, we talk about this a lot. It's an official event, but there is obviously a campaign context and a campaign backdrop here. He's kind of on defense because some Dems in the last 24 hours have said, wait a second, you delivered a big speech on threats to democracy last night. What about the economy? You need to talk about that more. I asked this question to New Jersey Congressman Mikey Sherrill. She is in a race of her own in New Jersey. I asked her about that speech. Here's what she told me. Was that a mistake?
I think as members of government, as people who are public servants, we need to address the nation's concerns. And certainly the concerns I hear in my district do involve the economy. The concerns involve inflation and gas prices and abortion and democracy. And I think it's incumbent upon us to address all of those. We're not one-trick ponies in Congress. We need to address all the nation's issues.
I imagine, Kelly, that is some of what you are hearing reflected from folks you're talking to at the White House, that President Biden can walk and chew gum or talk Democratic threats and the economy at the same time.
Very much so. And I think they think that some of these issues appeal to certain parts of the Democratic constituency as well as the public broadly. And so there is value in trying to check certain boxes. When you mentioned an official event, that means it's a White House official event. The taxpayers foot the bill for the president to travel there. White House staffers stage the event. And the president's talking about something that has to do with policy, even though we're in a political atmosphere. And talking about student loan debt forgiveness is something that allowed the president, while in New Mexico, to give some of the local statistics. More than 200,000 New Mexicans who have student loan debt who could have relief from his plan is something that he can then talk about, saying that is putting the economy of those families and people in the state front and center, a way to put money back in the pockets of Americans, New Mexicans in this case, when that issue of how do you balance the monthly budget is on the minds of so many Americans. At the same time, talking about a policy that he thinks differentiates his administration and Democrats from the Republicans he's running against as the head of the Democratic Party. So part of what they're trying to do is use the president's megaphone. He's going to friendlier locations, but they hope the message goes beyond the borders of where he is to talk about that array of issues. Abortion rights matters to a certain segment of who they're trying to make sure turns out. The younger voters who can often be difficult to get to turn out. That matters with student loans, although we know many people well into their middle years have student loan debt. And then, of course, his themes about democracy and what's at stake. The president trying to be all things to all people in these final days.
You cover the current president now, Kelly. You covered the previous president previously. We are seeing him, Donald Trump, out on the campaign trail tonight, too, in Iowa. And I wonder how we should read the tea leaves there, because, yeah, sure, Senator Chuck Grassley is up for re-election. But also Iowa is like a 2024 state big time, Kel. And there is, I mean, listen, I know you still talk to, I'm sure, former, Trump folks. Like, is he going to run? Is he not? Is he going to let the speculation linger? Is he going to try to crowd out the field by making some announcement about his next White House run, maybe in the next month or so? Like, a lot of question marks, and Iowa is like a punctuation point of its own on this whole thing.
Yeah, we've never been able to put our Trump files away. They're always right at the ready. So, yes, it feels like very familiar territory. Donald Trump, we have seen many times, likes to also have multiple layers to his events. It is always a rally about himself, first and foremost. And if he can serve the Republican Party and candidates who are helpful to him at the same time, that is helpful, too. And Chuck Grassley has been a very dedicated supporter of his. Chuck Grassley, who is the most senior Republican, 89 years old, running for a 6-year term, and has been one of the Republican senators who visits all 88 counties of Iowa every year. So he is someone who is certainly going to stand with Donald Trump, and he'll get some praise from Donald Trump. But for Donald Trump, Iowa means a lot of other things. It is a place that has welcomed him. It is a place that is a kickoff to the presidential cycle. And just the fact that you and I are talking about the presidential cycle
Kelly.
is a win for him.
True. How can you avoid it, though, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, I think that some people might hear that as an indictment of the media, but it's like, hey, this is the reality of what's on the ground here.
Exactly.
5 days. Yeah, 5 days before the election. Kelly O'Donnell, can't wait to talk to you for the next 96 hours straight. Appreciate it.
Good to see
Turning
you.
to some news now from overseas, because just this afternoon we heard from the State Department and the White House confirming that U.S. Embassy officials over in Russia finally met with detained WNBA superstar Brittney Griner today. This is the first in-person meeting they've had in months. The State Department spokesperson saying they saw firsthand her tenacity, her perseverance, despite her present circumstances. Again, her present circumstances, she is behind bars in a Russian prison. The White House press secretary telling reporters on Air Force One that Griner's doing as well as can be expected under the circumstances. And then, interestingly, she got into what the administration is doing to try to get Griner out. She says they're still following up on this offer to help get her home, that it's a top priority, et cetera. But this prisoner swap question is still out there. It's still hanging. The visit comes a week after a Russian court rejected Griner's push to try to appeal her 9-year prison sentence, again, for bringing cannabis oil into the country. Joining us now is Josh Letterman. This was not a you're getting out visit from a U.S. diplomat. This was like a check-in visit. And what we heard from the White House press secretary was this idea that they are going to work on alternative ways of trying to get her out because, frankly, from our perspective, right, the potential for a prisoner swap seems to be kind of stalled at the moment.
That's right. And under the Vienna Conventions, Hallie, countries are supposed to have regular, consistent access to their citizens who are imprisoned in foreign countries. So you can imagine that the State Department, the U.S. government, wants to try to have access to her as often as they possibly can, not only to gauge how she's doing, but to be able to try to coordinate on these ongoing efforts to try to get her released. And this was the first time that U.S. consular officials were able to visit Brittney Griner since that rejected appeal last month. And, you know, there have been real questions about exactly how she's doing. You heard the White House say as well as can be expected, but there have been reports that this has been there's been a real psychological toll spending, you know, since February now in Russian prison. And so this is part of an ongoing effort by the U.S. to try to do everything they possibly can to bring her home as quickly as possible. But you're absolutely right. For now, this visit in and of itself does not bring Brittney Griner any close to getting out of Russia and back to the United States.
I hear Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson. I hear him. I see him when he tweets and he says she should be commended for her tenacity and perseverance, of course. This is also really tough on Brittney Griner, not just on her, but on her wife, Sherelle, who's been out. She was on The View just this week talking about just the mental strain of having to go through this. Not just the Griners, but Paul Whelan, too, who's also detained there.
That's absolutely right. And it also comes as there seems to be diminishing hope for a quick return for Brittney Griner to the United States, which obviously is going to only create even more pain and torment for her and for her wife and her other family members. You know, if you rewind a few months ago to when this was first starting to work its way through Russia's judicial system, the thinking was that once she's actually been convicted, once a sentence has been handed down, then it's sort of the judicial part is over, and there's an opportunity for politics to enter and for there to be negotiations to try to get her free as part of some prisoner swap. And the U.S. thought they were a large part of the way there when the United States made an offer to trade her for Victor Bout, a convicted Russian arms dealer who is incarcerated in the United States. But by all indications, there's been no movement from the Russians, not even a response formally from the Russians to that proposal. And that has really left the United States looking to see what other possibilities they may have to try to get her free, with the U.S. government saying today they're looking at all possible options. We don't know if that means a different type of trade. Maybe there would be additional Russians they would release in exchange for both Brittney Griner and American Paul Whelan, who is also held there. He is also another priority for the United States as they try to bring these detained Americans home, Hallie.
Josh Letterman live for us there from overseas in London. Appreciate it. Back here at home, a huge shift in strategy from the CDC today that'll give doctors more flexibility in how they prescribe opioids. It is interesting. It is slightly controversial because the agency is announcing this sort of long-anticipated revamp of guidelines from back in 2016. Those guidelines were criticized by doctors and prescribers for being too strict. The CDC is like, okay, I hear you. They are acknowledging that. They say their previous guidelines on doses for opioids, tapering for drugs, sometimes didn't get applied correctly, which hurt patients. The new guidelines released today say opioids should not be the go-to treatment in cases, though, where some other treatments can provide the same level of pain management. Dr. Natalie Azar joins us now. Help us understand this in plain English, because part of this is there's an opioid crisis in this country, right? The CDC basically, years ago, tried to crack down on how much doctors could prescribe of this in hopes that that would help. Now they're saying, okay, we maybe need to be a little bit more flexible. How significant is this change in guidelines?
So it's pretty significant, Hallie. I mean, I think you kind of laid it out there, and the time frame, I think, is an easy way to think about it. Opioid crisis, CDC dramatically overcorrects in 2016 and says, you know, we need to put a shelf and a limit on the dose and the duration of treatment, and it's a one-size-fits-all. And what happened? There was a huge fallout. Patients who were suddenly, tapered off of their medications abruptly. They were undertreated. They were untreated, which led to a lot of psychological damage in addition to a whole slew of other things. So now the CDC is walking it back. And I think the theme here is that care with opioids needs to be individualized. They're no longer saying, no, opioids are not appropriate for this, that, or the other thing, but that it depends on the patient's situation, and it certainly is at the discretion of the provider, without specifying this is how long you can treat and how long you should treat. But I will say, Hallie, that they still don't necessarily endorse opioids for the treatment of chronic pain, and that gets into the weeds a little bit. But the issue of the fact that we still have a major pain problem in this country is not solely addressed by these new guidelines.
So what should the takeaway be for people who do have chronic pain, or for people who, I hear it a lot. I do some reporting on, for example, cannabis. I was on the out a year ago doing a series on that, and people would say to me, I don't want opioids, I want something else, right? They have chronic pain, they want other ways to treat it, they want other options than opioids.
Well, I spend a lot of time in my office explaining to patients why we don't have a huge arsenal of non-opioid analgesics, because, we really, with blinders on for decades, we're over-prescribing narcotics, and suddenly, whoops, it's like the carpet is just left out from under our feet. I think that if you're a patient, and I see these patients all the time in my office, who is on a dose of opioid and it's working for them, that's great. The biggest problem I think that we find in terms of managing pain is initiating opioid treatment for patients who ultimately become chronic pain patients. In those situations, it's really not ideal. There's a lot of evidence and literature to support not using opioids for chronic pain other than patients with sickle cell or cancer of end of life. We are not talking about those patients. This is a moment, again, Hallie, where it's so imperative that the entire pain and research community really, really puts their efforts into finding other options for non-opioid pain management. There is such a need in this country. I think patients who are pain patients will be relieved by this, because they're going to feel, there's less onus on the doctor now. There's a little bit more flexibility, less regulatory, pressure for doctors not to prescribe. So they're going to feel a little bit of a relief. I think it's a step in the right direction, but we still have a way to go.
Dr. Natalie Azar, what a great breakdown. Thank you for helping us understand that. I really appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, a formerly unglamorous position, kind of, now under real intense scrutiny in next week's midterms. Why secretaries of state are center stage this year. I talked with two of them running in one key state. Plus, Gabby Petito's family is suing Utah police, saying they ignored signs of violence before her death. How the department's responding in our 5 things. Election integrity is on the ballot this year, specifically when it comes to a race that, we don't talk a ton about historically. We haven't. Secretaries of state. Okay, with threats to democracy, one of the top issues for voters in our NBC News polling. Remember, these are people who are responsible for making sure the elections run okay, thrown into the spotlight after 2020, because some of them worked to help prevent former President Trump from overturning the legit election results. Some of them worked to help him on that front. Some candidates running on Tuesday are still buying into the lie that Joe Biden somehow did not win in 2020 legitimately. He did, of course, but all of this could have a big impact on 2024. Secretary of State races, not exactly marquee competitions in years past, but this cycle, a new focus. Out of the 27 races nationally, 13 Republicans and independent candidates have denied or questioned the 2020 election, including in key presidential battlegrounds like Arizona and Michigan. That matters since the Secretary of State typically oversees elections, with the concern and the spotlight intensifying.
If you're reelected, what will you do to assure that you can be trusted?
Does it surprise you how much attention nationally these Secretary of State races are getting?
Well, I think it's a sign of the times. And unfortunately, going into 2021 and now this year, we're seeing the continued attack on voting rights and the attempted destabilization of American elections.
Jenna Griswold is running in Colorado, where things look a little different. That's because her challenger, Republican Pam Anderson, is not an election denier. And while Anderson has faced criticism from her opponent for appearing alongside those who question the election, she says she's worked to try and convince the skeptics in her party of the truth.
What I think works is going into the rooms where people have been influenced by conspiracy and lies, talking about my candidacy for 5 minutes, and then answering questions. I have seen it change hearts and minds. Divisive, polarizing rhetoric and pointing fingers is not effective.
Secretaries of State facing challenges these days they've never seen before. In 2021, remember, Georgia's Secretary of State was asked by former President Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 election in that state.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
If you got a call from a president or a high-ranking official asking you to do something similar, what would you do?
Say absolutely not and report it to authorities. Just the fact that that is a question indicates the stakes that we're seeing around the country.
If I got a call from a president or anyone trying to influence an outcome of election in that way, I would say no, hang up, and my next call would be to the Attorney General.
The stakes high and the rhetoric hot, dangerously so, with elections workers nationally facing more and more threats. One study finding a third of those officials in 2021 feeling unsafe because of their jobs. We've seen people condemn, of course, harassment, threats, intimidation against elections officials, and yet it persists.
It is reprehensible and should be not tolerated from any source. Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, poll workers, election officials, watchers are doing this for our values, and they should be protected and defended.
Griswold herself has seen it personally with the Nebraska man now behind bars for threatening her after the 2020 election. How much does that weigh on you heading into Election Day?
Well, it's very concerning. It's concerning to see the normalization of threats of violence, because in a democracy, how it should work is we work out our differences at the ballot box, and then we're all united under the flag.
Secretaries of State, the front lines in the fight for democracy, with a new spotlight now on a critical position. Keep in mind, not all secretaries of state are elected. Only 33 of them are. The other 17 are appointed by either the governor, the state legislature, or the Commission on Elections, which again makes those gubernatorial and state races critically important. We're going to keep an eye on that story as the elections get closer. But for now, we'll get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, looks like Bibi's back. Israel's Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, conceded defeat to Benjamin Netanyahu today, saying he wishes Netanyahu success. The government that he appears likely to form would be the most right-wing in the country's history. That sound is number 2, that alarm that went off in parts of central and northern Japan today, telling people to get to shelter ASAP. Why? Japanese officials say North Korea fired off multiple ballistic missiles, triggering that warning system. South Korea says it thinks one of those missiles was intercontinental. It comes as North Korea says the U.S. and South Korea's extension of their Air Force drills was a risky and wrong decision. The U.S. wants the UN Security Council to meet tomorrow about this North Korea issue. Number 3, one of the most commonly used antibiotics, kind of in low supply right now. The FDA says there's a shortage of the oral version of amoxicillin. It's used to treat bacterial infections like pneumonia and bronchitis. We don't really know why there's a shortage. That's not really clear. Also not clear how long it's going to last. We're out to the FDA for more on this, waiting for a comment there. Number 4, Gabby Petito's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit today against the Moab City Police Department. Officers from that department last year say they stopped Petito and her fiancé, Brian Laundrie, over a possible domestic violence call. 2 weeks later, she died. Petito's parents say that if police handle the situation differently, Gabby may have still been alive. They want $50 million in damage. Police say the officers are not responsible for Petito's eventual murder. Number 5, you feeling lucky? If you are, get your Powerball ticket. The jackpot now at $1.5 billion. So far, the second biggest jackpot in Powerball history. If one person wins it and they choose a lump sum, they're going to get something like $745 million. Would you love to see that in your bank account? Next drawing is on Saturday. So we're getting some breaking news into us just as we speak here tonight on NBC News Now. The husband of House Speaker Paul Pelosi released from the hospital, according to 2 sources, including a family member. The 82-year-old has spent nearly a week in the ICU after he had a skull fracture. His right arm, his right hands were hurt when somebody broke into the Pelosi's home in San Francisco and attacked Paul Pelosi. Speaker Pelosi was not home. Aaron McLaughlin is in San Francisco. What else do we know, Aaron?
Hey, Hallie. Hallie. Well, according to two sources, including a family member confirming to NBC News that Paul Pelosi has been released from the hospital today, we saw his wife, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, arrive back to their home behind me earlier today. That was followed about an hour later by a white van with tinted windows. Unclear at this point if that van contained Paul Pelosi, but now this information from a family member as well as another source that he is in fact inside the Pelosi residence behind me as I speak. The last time we heard formally about his condition from the Pelosi family was in the form of a public statement that Nancy Pelosi released on Monday, saying that he was making steady progress, but that it would be a long road to recovery. Hallie.
Aaron, we have been looking at video, too. Speaker Pelosi has obviously flew back to San Francisco the day of this attack. She's been going to the hospital to visit her husband. He is now, as you report, at home. And it comes as we're learning more about this alleged attacker, too. David DePape.
Yeah, and we're hearing from the Department of Homeland Security indicate that David DePape is actually here in this country illegally. He's a Canadian citizen arriving in the United States on what was supposed to be a 6-month visa in March 2008, though he's still here some 14 years later. Department of Homeland Security saying that they are now taking steps to take action on that. The expectation would be that he'd be deported after serving a potential sentence if he's convicted from a raft of felony charges now against him by both the state as well as the federal government. Department of Homeland Security sources saying that he would be serving that sentence before being deported back to Canada if he was in fact found guilty. The maximum sentence for the charges against him, the state charges at least, is life in prison. So it is worth noting that, Hallie.
Aaron McLaughlin live for us with that breaking news there out of San Francisco. Aaron, thank you. Let's talk about what's happening in the world of streaming, because the latest video to hit Netflix is not exactly binge-worthy in a lot of people's eyes. You have Netflix today announcing a new membership plan that includes commercials. I guess if you like binging commercials, you're into this. Netflix's basic with ads plan is going to cost $6.99. That's $3 less than their current basic plan. So, okay, you save a few bucks. Because of that, you'll see about 4 or 5 minutes of ads for every hour of content. And subscribers with the plan will have to make a couple other streaming sacrifices. Some shows will not be available on this tier because of licensing restrictions. And subscribers won't be able to download shows or movies to watch offline, like if you're on a plane or a train or don't have internet or whatever. The move's coming as Disney Plus is set to introduce its own ad-based subscription plan next month. CNBC's Alex Sherman joins us now. Big change for Netflix, Alex, because the execs there have always said, hey, we're not going to do targeted ads because of data privacy issues. But the problem now for them is like everybody's sharing the password. So you and all of your college roommates and friends, and sisters, like all have the same Netflix account. Is that what's behind this?
Well, that's sort of derivative of what's behind this, Hallie. I mean, the even bigger picture than that is Netflix growth stopped earlier this year. So part of that is the fact that everyone's sharing passwords. So fewer people are subscribing and paying on their own. Another part of that is that they may have simply hit a ceiling, at least in this country and in Canada, where really they haven't had growth for over a year now. So Netflix is trying to come up with new ways to reinvigorate revenue and subscriber growth, and coming up with an advertising tier that's $6.99 a month, as you said, $3 cheaper per month than their current cheapest product at $9.99 per month, is a new way that they could theoretically entice potentially millions of more people around the world to sign up to Netflix who simply haven't because they felt like it was too expensive.
Yeah, and because so the strategy here, it's not so much people who might downgrade their subscriptions, right? It's like bringing in new people who go, well, $10 a month feels like a lot, but like $7, maybe I can swing that. That feels more manageable, basically.
Right. So Netflix addressed this issue on their most recent earnings call, where it said basically they expected some shifting from the basic $9.99 plan to the basic $6.99 plan. For those people, the amount of money that Netflix will make from the advertising revenue should either make that a complete wash, or actually Netflix will be better off, meaning they will make more money for every customer that switches from the $9.99 plan to the $6.99 plan, even though they're paying Netflix less in subscription revenue. However, they don't expect too many people to switch from the more expensive plan because that comes with other perks, such as the things that you mentioned, downloading videos for airplanes and streaming multiple streams on multiple devices.
You know, just to give the landscape to people, we showed this graphic, and I want to talk through it because it's interesting. You've got Hulu with ads went up $1 a month when you look at their pricing. ESPN Plus with ads went up $3. Disney Plus, we talked about. Netflix, the cheapest streaming with ads options at $6.99. Can I just be real honest with you, Alex? Like, I am such a streaming person that, like, when I was streaming something recently with ads, I was like, what are we doing? Why am I wasting my life watching commercials, right? Like, are people, like, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a millennial and I used to watch commercials and now I don't. Like, talk to me about the viewer, like the landscape of streaming sort of generally on this front.
So
I don't think I'm a total freak show. Like, I think a lot of people think like me and find commercials really annoying.
No one on earth I mean, like, I shouldn't say no one on earth likes ads. I'm sure there's some people out there that love advertisements, but by and large, particularly younger people, as you say, have no tolerance really for ads, or minimal tolerance. You know, they may be able to deal with an ad before and after a show, but I don't think anybody likes the interrupting ads. However, you need to juxtapose our current streaming landscape to what you had before, which was cable, where you had no choice at all. So at least now you can kind of pick and choose between the different services you want instead of just paying $100 per month for cable.
Alex Sherman, the voice of reason, as always. It's good to see you back on the show, Alex. Thank you. Coming up here, evacuations in Louisiana after an acid leak. We'll talk about what happened in the local. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, Louisiana officials say some people will be allowed back into their homes today after hundreds were evacuated over a derailed tank car leaking. What was it leaking? Hydrochloric acid. Yikes. Happened about 50 miles from New Orleans yesterday. Officials there are testing some of the soil closer to the spill to make sure it's not still contaminated. No reports of any injuries, luckily, but if you breathe in, like the fumes from the acid, that can really hurt you. Not clear why this train derailed in the first place. From our Northeast Bureau, investigators in Massachusetts are looking for info about somebody who may have been married to the so-called Lady of the Dunes. She was the oldest unidentified murder victim in the state until this week, when the FBI ID'd her. Her body was found on Cape Cod nearly 50 years ago. Police think she got married to somebody 6 months before her death. He apparently had a questionable past, this guy, including being a suspect in the deaths of a previous wife and stepdaughter. According to his obituary, he died 20 years ago. And out of our Southeast and Northeast bureaus, the cities of Philly and Houston facing off in baseball and football tonight. The World Series tied 2-2 between the Astros and the Phillies after that no-no from Houston last night. That's only happened once before, a no-hitter in the World Series back in 1956. So the Astros are going to play Philly, and at the same time in Houston, the Eagles are going to play the Texans on Thursday Night Football. Do you know what my plans are for the evening? It's the Eagles. I'm going to be honest. It's the Eagles, but I'll have the Phillies on too. So big night for Philly people. So tonight's original now, a topic we're watching, of course, school board races. This is interesting, right? If you say live in Boston and you're wondering, like, okay, Hallie, I hear you on why I should care about Senate and House races. Why should I care about a local school board race in Tampa if I live up in Massachusetts or whatever? Comes down to a couple of old political cliches. All politics is local, and follow the money. Governors are getting involved in these races. They're endorsing candidates. PACs are pouring in millions of dollars. This stuff matters because it is a high-profile, hot-button national issue, and it affects your life, your kids' lives, your little siblings' lives, your nieces, your nephews. Sam Brock has the story.
For a good portion of the country,
we're going to be recessing until we can get the situation under control.
School board chaos like this in Dearborn, Michigan, has become commonplace.
Guys, they're going to shut down the meeting if you guys don't comply.
Parents clashing over the possible banning of half a dozen books.
Democracy.
What began as a reaction to COVID policies and masks
none of the kids wear them correctly
has evolved into many subjects parents hold near and dear to their hearts.
This did not happen over 1 minute. To find our education system to go to where it is now happened over a course of decades.
Bridget Ziegler is a Sarasota County, Florida school board member and co-founder of Moms for Liberty, a group that advocates for parental rights in schools. For her, she says the tipping point was talking about gender identity in the classroom.
You think some parents would be surprised to learn that their children are being asked at such young ages which pronoun they would like to use?
Yes, an example, when we were growing up, you'd put name and date. Now it's pronoun, name and date at kindergarten.
The group is demanding what it says is a basic parental right, access to what their children learn.
If you're promoting things that you know certain families do not support or do not want to introduce their child at a certain age. So again, that's the woke ideology. It goes full circle of the hypocrisy is rich.
For high school history teachers Barbara Siegel and Richard Judd in South Florida's Broward County, the reality is quite different.
Are teachers even talking about sexual orientation and, gender identity in classrooms, to your knowledge?
No.
No.
It's not a topic that you talk about. We teach students.
And yet it's become so high profile. Why do you think that is?
Politics.
It sells.
Among Ziegler's powerful allies, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis.
We believe in education, not indoctrination.
DeSantis has personally endorsed 30 school board candidates this election cycle, including Ziegler, spending thousands from his own political action committee. 19 have already won, and 6 more are competing in a runoff Tuesday. Unprecedented amounts of money are also pouring in from conservative PACs. The 1776 Project has spent nearly $3 million, according to FEC filings. On its website, the group lists dozens of candidates receiving support in Florida and states all across the country.
Republicans are beginning to realize, more so than Democrats, that their base of support is expandable.
Dr. Robert Stein is a professor of political science at Rice University. He says developing candidates is also key to the movement's success.
What they are able to do with school board races, and I've seen it here in Harris County in Texas, is they build a bench. They build like the Astros do. They get a good farm team. And what makes a good candidate is somebody who's run for office, has won, and raised money.
The ramifications are trickling down to education policy. Siegel and Judd just attended Florida's voluntary workshops on civic standards.
A lot of these conservative advocates are saying is, we just don't want religion in the classroom at all. We want it to be apolitical, areligious. Is that the impression you're getting?
Not from the workshop that we went to. In that workshop, they made clear arguments that there was no separation of church and state, that that's a myth.
Did anything surprise you?
Absolutely. In the same very workshop, it was as if Jesus was one of our founding fathers.
Whatever the topic of contention may be,
the majority of people that walked out of there truly felt that their voice wasn't properly heard.
There's little doubt the strategy is working.
It's a playbook that you see in states other than Florida.
Do you think Republicans are winning from that playbook right now?
Oh, they're killing it. They're absolutely killing it.
There has been a very clear erosion of parents' roles, rights, and in their child's education. There is a correction that parents need to understand their rights, but they also need to understand their responsibility. They need to stop.
Sam Brock is joining us now live. Sam, it is so fascinating. It's something we've been covering, me as a political journalist, for over a year now, right, since Glenn Youngkin in Virginia won his gubernatorial race, largely based on this issue of parental rights. We're seeing that now explode nationally. And this conservative PAC, 1776, the soundbite you had in your piece, somebody said they're killing it, right? Republicans are killing it. This PAC is kind of killing it here.
It's pretty evident, Hallie, that the strategy is working. And we spoke with the founder of the PAC, who it turns out is a former political consultant and a reporter who just so happened to be seeing a book that his 10-year-old godson was reading during COVID lockdown called Race Cars, a children's book for white privilege, or about white privilege. And he said, what are we talking about here? This has got to stop. He ended up raising some $3+ million over the course of the last couple of years. And Hallie, here's the thing. If you look at the money that's been generated, about half of it comes from contributions less than $200, which is to say it is reflective of a grassroots movement, not just a couple mega donors. They have those, but lots of people all over the country. And if you go to the website, you see hundreds of candidates, and next to their names, most of them say one, because they have about a 75% success rate so far. This gentleman told us that initially he was hunting for candidates. Now he has more than 350 people asking them for their political endorsement.
Sam Brock, it's great reporting. Thank you for bringing it to us live there from Coral Gables, Florida. I appreciate it. A bunch of governors now running. It's not just school board members, right? It is governors, it is House candidates, it is Senate candidates. So let's talk about governors, because 36 races are happening on Tuesday. You probably aren't going to focus on all 36 of them, right? That's kind of my job. But you do want to focus on a few of them, because like we talked about with these school board races, the governor's races matter even if you don't live in the particular state where this race is going down. There are candidates who have questioned the results of the 2020 election denying Republican governors who are running. And we're only a couple of years out now from when another set of electoral college votes is going to have to be certified. And after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, abortion rights have become more of a state issue. That means that the party that controls the governor's mansion is going to affect what happens with abortion access in that particular state. Senior political editor Mark Murray is here to take us through some of these key races, some of these key issues. So glad to have you. Thanks, before you jump off to New York for like what is going to be your marathon here. I'm super interested, and you know that on election night, this is going to be something that I'm really focusing on here. And I'm super interested in what's happening in places like Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where you have election skeptics, election deniers running on the Republican side for governor. How much is that weighing on the minds of voters, in your view?
It is and it isn't. Certainly rank and file Democrats, this has been a big issue, and we've seen it in advertising. And Hallie, I actually think this is an important issue for all of us, that come 2024, these are going to be the states that decide the next presidential election. And being an election denier, not only are you kind of signaling, well, I'm a Trumpian kind of candidate or maybe a Trumpian kind of governor, but the kind of question is like, well, if your party ends up losing, would you do the right thing and certify the election? That gets at the heart of it. Right. And what we've actually seen in our own polling, threats to democracy is one of the top issues. But when you kind of really drilling down to like what are voters and the persuadable middle voters caring about, sometimes it's not as much. And our colleague Von Hilliard ended up getting some really good sound from Arizona, where he was asking, he's like, are you voting on this issue or on meat and potatoes issues?
A lot of Democrats were hoping that folks like you on their idea of the threat to democracy over the certification of elections, that you would vote for Democrats because these folks have said they would not certify the 2020 election.
Yeah, that was troubling. I'm not going to say that wasn't in my thought process. I'm going to say it wasn't in my top two. So I have to prioritize. And to me, the economy and the border, that's what I'm voting on.
Well, that says a lot right there.
In the battleground state of Arizona.
So she talked about, economy and the border. We know abortion access is also big in states, including in Kansas, which has a fascinating gubernatorial race. I think people remember we covered it on this show back in August. There was a referendum, and Kansas voters upheld abortion rights in that state, which is a bit of a surprise given how red it is. Has a Democratic governor, people forget. Our producer, Emma Barnett, went to Kansas. She traveled out there this weekend, talked to people about how this issue, reproductive rights, abortion access, is guiding voters there. Listen.
The whole idea of being pro-life is very, very important to me, much more so than anything about taxes or even the economy.
I don't think that a politician should make health choices for a woman. My husband and I decided a long time ago that if a party member was not going to be pro-life, we wouldn't vote for them.
Abortion should still be a given because it's a right.
Because I'm pro-life, I do want someone who is going to push more pro-life agendas, but I also appreciate that we live in America where we have the freedom of choice.
A wide variety of thoughts and opinions there, but it speaks to how much of an issue this is going to be in this race in Kansas in particular.
Yeah, it's still energized even months after that August referendum, Hallie. And, this is a toss-up race right now. The Democratic Governor Laura Kelly facing Republican Derek Schmidt. Even with the headwinds that Democrats are facing right now, there are Republicans who actually say, hey, this is a really competitive race that's going on in Kansas right now. Abortion's on top of issue. Also, the Sam Brownback years as governor is really weighed down on the Republican Party still. So kind of a 1-2 punch that Republicans are facing there.
What else are you watching for as far as the gubernatorial landscape here? I'm asking you selfishly as my cheat sheet for election night, too.
So, Hallie, if the winds are really at Republicans' back right now, a place that I'm going to watch is New Mexico. That is, you have the Democratic governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham.
Today,
Mark Ronchetti, a former weatherman, popular weatherman in New Mexico, is running against her. it is a potential for Republicans to be able to win if they're having a great night. Another place that we're going to watch, Oregon. Oregon hasn't had a Republican governor in 40 years.
Yeah.
There's a three-way race that's involved there, but it is a possibility that you could end up seeing a Republican governor in Oregon, too. Again, if the winds are really blowing a Republicans back. If not, then maybe Democrats are able not only, to win in Kansas, but also elsewhere.
I will say, what I hear when you say that is have extra coffee ready, because those are polls that close way late in the night. So we are going to be up real late talking about
maybe
those.
New Mexico, not as much, but Oregon's going to be a really long race.
The wee hours, if you will.
Right.
Mark Murray, thank you. Great to see you. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Hallie.
When we come back, some of the world's most famous glaciers, including right here in the U.S., on track to disappear, maybe sooner than you think. We've got this new warning coming up. Some new details out tonight about how Yosemite National Park, one of the most iconic parks in this country, is probably going to look a lot different in the next 30 years. Take a look. This is what we're used to seeing at one of the most popular parks in the country. Maybe you're one of the 3.5 million people who visited last year. This is what it looks like, right? But a new UN report out today is warning that glaciers here and in at least a third of the world's heritage sites will be gone by 2050. And if that seems far away, just add 30 years to however old you are, right? Not that much. Think about your kids if you have them. Glaciers are melting so fast right now. Look at this. They're losing 60 billion tons of ice a year. That's the same amount of water that people use every year in all of Spain and France combined. That is tons of water, literally. So today, the UN is saying this report is also a call to action, and it's something they specifically want to address at this big global climate conference next week in Egypt. Bill Cairns is joining us now. And Bill, one of the things I think just to pull back the curtain and be super transparent, as this show likes to do, like one of the things we talk about is climate is a really important issue, I think, to a lot of people. And how do we talk about it on the news and sort of visually explain it and explain like what it means and how it affects your actual life? Because sometimes it feels like we talk about degrees and temperature and like the Arctic. Like this one, I think this report does hit close to home to people, because if you haven't been to Yosemite, you sure know what it is.
Yeah, and visuals help. I mean, we can't see methane in the air. We can't see carbon dioxide. Can you imagine if we could, how different things would be? So let's talk about these two glaciers that they were mentioning in the report in Yosemite. So this is the McClure Glacier, and you can see this is a summertime view. Obviously, in the winter, covered with snow and covered with ice, and you can see where the ice sheet is here. So that's one of the ones that they say we're going to lose in the next 20 years, or next 10 to 20 years. And then the Lyell Glacier is a little smaller of the two. They're located right next to each other, and this one, you can see how thin it is. They think this one could be gone in a decade or so. So here's a before and after going back to 1883 of the Lyell Glacier. You can see where all the ice was on top. In the exact same camera position about 130 years later, you can see how spotty the ice is. We actually have an animation that they put together because they've been tracking and measuring these at the national park, going back to the late 1800s. And you can see in this animation how they've been measuring it in year after year and decade after decade. It's slowly shrinking. So it's no surprise. We were going to lose these anyways, but because we're warming our climate even faster now because of global warming and fossil fuels, Hallie, we're going to lose them sooner than we should have.
There are some places that are trying to get creative to try to slow down the rate at which ice melts. In some places in Switzerland, we're going to show people they cover the ice with blankets to try to stop that. But experts point out it's really hard to scale that up, right, to have a real impact. What can we do?
Well, the scientific name for this is what we call geoengineering. And, we're trying to find ways to stop our planet from warming as fast because we know that the carbon dioxide that we're pumping in the atmosphere is going to be here for like 100,000 years, and the methane is going to be here, for hundreds of years. And so we have about 8,000 glaciers in the western U.S. So, yes, we're going to lose them slowly here over time, but we're trying to prevent that. So some of the ideas that have been out there, one has been seeding our skies. We know when we have volcanoes that shoot sulfate into the air, it reflects the sunlight. Volcanoes, when they erupt, actually can cool the planet. We thought about doing that ourselves, but a lot of scientists are like, we don't know all the effects of that.
Yeah.
Other ideas were pumping seawater onto ice and hoping it would refreeze. And how about this one, Hallie? Having robots build underwater walls to protect sea level glaciers. So, yeah, there's a lot of crazy ideas out there, but we have to try something.
Bill Cairns, that is fascinating. Please come back, talk to us more about all of that. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you. If we had 3 more hours, I'd talk to Bill about it now, but that is a wrap for this hour. Another busy day. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. It's good to be with you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.